I've already run 5 unique tests on the Monster Hunter Wilds benchmark calculator, and I've figured out exactly which settings you need to adjust to maximize your performance in the game and really to see how well the game will actually run on your PC, because without this information, you could be running the benchmark test, think it's giving you 10 FPS, and without changing a few really key features, you're not able to maximize that performance and truly see just how good it's going to run on your PC. Before we get started, how do you get this new benchmark calculator? Basically, you go to the Steam store. Okay, very, very simple. You type in Monster Hunter, and Monster Hunter Wilds will be the top option. And then right here will be download Monster Hunter Wilds benchmark. It's free for everyone. Basically, what it does, as far as I'm aware, is it downloads all of the game files, or a lot of them, onto your PC. And then when you run it, you essentially get to play through, or it shows you the first parts of the game with an automated playthrough. You can't actually play through it yourself. It shows you those first parts of the game, and then through that, it actually tells you exactly how much frames per second you could be getting. And you can change all of your settings and things as if you were inside the game itself as well. So as soon as you download that, it will go into your library. After that, you can just hit the play button and you are good to go. You will be in the benchmark calculator. This is footage I prepared earlier from that. I tried actually running it while I was doing this video, but the benchmark calculator basically hogs the crap out of your PC so we can do its tests properly. And so things like my OBS and camera and stuff, we're not going to function alongside it. And so instead I have a recording of me using it so that you can actually see what I'm doing. So once you get in, this is what you'll be presented with. You'll have benchmark, loop, which I think will just keep the benchmark going over and over again, options, Steam store, and quit. Options is very important here. You want to go that and edit all these settings like I'm about to show you. The first thing you've got is your display screen, which is just the screen you're on. The screen mode, borderless window or window were the only 2 options I have. I don't know if some people have full screen, but borderless windowed is fine. The resolution, I like to use my native resolution when I record videos. I typically downplay it to 1080p because I don't have the hardware strong enough to record it at 1440, but 1440 is 2K in this case. Aspect ratio automatic, HDR output automatically enable. All that is fine. NVIDIA reflex doesn't really matter for this. It will actually hamper your performance a little bit because it's more about improving how fast your peripherals work, but it won't have too big an impact. On this first page, you don't need to worry too much. You can see at the top here, it's actually the third tab across is what we're at here, right? Okay, so we'll continue. That's fine. You can change all that stuff if you want. Then we get into the 4th tab across, which has all of the settings that are important to this video. Okay, so it gets really interesting here. We have graphics settings, high, medium, low, and lowest, and ultra. I didn't do any tests at ultra because that's overkill, but I did my tests at varying ranges of these. So I'll show you exactly which one of these actually made an impact in just a moment. So you've got all these right here. You can just select it and do things. And then you've got NVIDIA DLSS. Okay, now this is really, really important. So if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, like a 4090 or 4080 or whatever it might be, then the DLSS is relevant to you. For all NVIDIA cards, except for the 10 series, but if you have the 10 series, you're probably not going to be able to run this game, so it doesn't matter too much. For all the cards except for the 10 series, you can use DLSS. And what that does is it essentially runs the game. So say you want to play it at 2K or 4K or whatever, right? It will actually run the game at 1080p and then use AI and other upscaling techniques to make it look like it's 2K and 4K and actually improve all the textures and overall quality and things like that so that it is almost indistinguishable. Now you will notice it's a little bit janky, but for the most part, it actually looks really, really good. So this is a must if you were using an NVIDIA graphics card. Now, if you also have a 40 series card, which is really top of the range, it will also enable frame generation for you that will essentially double your frame output. Now, not quite, because it's going to take a little bit of hardware power to actually do this, but basically it'll run the game at 30 frames per second and fill in every second frame with an AI generated frame that the NVIDIA hardware has packed on board. But that is only for 40 series cards. They might add that for lower but later. The other thing you have here is AMD FSR. If you have an AMD card, you get frame generation on pretty much anything, I think. I think that works for most AMD cards. Intel has does onboard graphics, you don't want to be using that. And disable, I don't really recommend that. Just use the DLSS, it is perfectly fine. So that is very important to understand. But what you might have missed is just underneath that, you've got upscaling mode. Now, I didn't go into it here, but the upscaling mode I currently have set is performance. And this is going to be one of the really key metrics we're going to be looking at when it comes to this benchmark test. Basically, upscaling performance, when you click into that, you've got high quality, I believe, quality, performance, and ultra performance. I think there's a balanced one in the middle. Balance is probably pretty good. Quality, I really prefer because I'm really all about it looking visually appealing. But really, if you want to get high frames, this is one of the ones you absolutely have to change to performance or ultra performance. And I'll show you that a little bit later in the video with my tests. After that, your graphic settings at the top, which is medium, high quality, and so on, will actually adjust a lot of these other things. The other one that it doesn't affect too much is ray tracing. As you can see, as I pan through the different ray tracing things here, low, you can see a huge difference from off to low. Low, medium, and high all look pretty much the same to me. I can't notice them. But I really like to use low, but if your graphics card isn't very good, you definitely want to turn off ray tracing. It takes a lot of bandwidth and hardware, and I'll show you that in just a minute. I also really like turning off motion blur, but that is just for me personally. Really, if you've got really bad specs, turn everything to lower setting. Besides that, I didn't actually find that those settings mattered a whole lot. But basically, once you've done all your settings, and I'll go through the settings in just a moment, you get into it. It's got a bit of a loading screen. Don't worry about that. It takes a while. Once you do that, it will enter into the cinematic. Do not base your FPS off the cinematic. I cannot stress that enough. Typically in benchmark tests, you have 3 key metrics you want to look at. You have a low point, a midpoint, and a high point. You want to be basing your performance off of the low points because when you go through those scenes, you're gonna have spikes of frames dropping down to like really low numbers. And if those numbers make the game really annoying to you, but if you don't mind only the low points being affected, that's fine. But we don't know where the low points are in the game. And so you really do need to kind of base some stuff on here. For example, in this section of the benchmark, you look at a few monsters, you don't really fight any of them, and you go through some other areas and things like that. If our low point is also the same for Ray Dow, you definitely want to be performing well during a big fight with one of the monsters. So you need to be considering that low point. The high point in this case is actually this intro cutscene. That has been my highest frames on every single test I did. And so do not be basing your FPS on that. You need to get past that and into the gameplay. As we enter the gameplay, you will see that this is another decent high point, so don't base it too much on that. Once you jump down into the zone, that is your midpoint. That's kind of your baseline. Most of your idle movement and things like that, maybe some of your easier battles and things like that, are probably going to be sitting around these frames. I've got 47 on the settings I just showed you before. You shouldn't really take that too seriously. I was recording the footage as well, and so my hardware was getting pushed to the limit to get the recording done, and so I wouldn't really be considering that too heavily. But this is the midpoint, and then you've got to wait quite a bit in here. I recorded from start to finish. So about 4 minutes in, you're going to get to this stage where they enter the village. And this is a drastic low point in the entire benchmark test. This is where you want it to sit at what you want. So you can see as I enter the village, my frames are dropping, and the average is really unpredictable here because it's basing it off that entire length. So that 2-minute cinematic or whatever is bringing up the average like crazy, but my actual frames are dropping all the way down to 30, whereas in the cinematic, I had 50 frames. And so you want to get to this point and look at what the frames are. They're your more real frames. Maybe it's just isolated to the village, so it's not a big deal, but they're your more real frames for the game. So you will want to be considering that when you're doing this benchmark test. So to summarize, the start is a high point, gonna mess up all your averages. The midpoint is really good to understand for what sort of frames you're getting. In this case, it was 40, but I had it recording. And then the low point is in the village, and you want to really be considering what these frames are and trying to get them as high as you possibly can. Personally, I think 30 FPS I'm getting a bit used to. I play on my Steam Deck a lot, and it often runs at 30 FPS for things. But you'll actually find that 45 FPS, you won't really notice a difference between 45 to 60 frames, despite what people might tell you. But I mean, I love trying to get up to 100 frames. That's just who I am. But really, anything above 40 or like consistently above 40, should be a really smooth gameplay experience no matter what device you're on. So highly recommend going for that as a baseline target if you care about the visuals of the game. If you don't care about the visuals of the game as much, just get that thing as high as you can. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so the tests. Here is, I'm just going to quickly go through them so that you can see kind of the difference in quality of the different tests. This is the first test at about 58 average frames. This is the second test. Still looks visually stunning. They're both at 2K. This is the third test, way higher frames at 2K as well. You can notice a little bit of weirdness with the textures in this one, but overall look absolutely fantastic. This is what I'll be going for because they got a consistent 60 frames. In the later section, I think I got a 55, 50, so absolutely perfect for my needs. So I'll be going for my test 3. Test 4 was at 2K as well. Even higher frames, but a tiny jump up from what we had before. And test 5 is a drop, even though we're going to 1080p because they upped some of the other settings and things like that. But you can see the quality of the gameplay is much lower, especially the shadows and things like that. It's a very different game at that point. But 1080p I actually really enjoy, and I usually use it because I use it for all my recording and things like that. But let's jump into the actual test benchmarks that I did. So test 1 we saw was an average FPS of about 58, probably a lot lower than that in the low points. You can see even in the planes there, it's sitting at around 40 FPS. It jumps quite a bit, so it could actually be a bit higher than that. Basically for this, I had DLSS on, I had that on for all of them. Ray tracing was on low. Ray tracing caused a lot of down momentum in the frames. We'll talk about that in a second. Ray tracing low, game quality was high, so really high quality on textures and everything. And upscaling mode was actually on quality, which is the second setting you really need to be thinking about when you're doing these benchmarking tests. Those two settings are the really main ones. As we get to test 2, the only thing I changed here was I dropped ray tracing and got rid of it, okay? And you can see the difference here. I went from 40 frames per second to 48. Ray tracing is going to kill your performance if your graphics card cannot handle it. Get rid of it as the very first thing you do. As we jump into the next one, I turned ray tracing off and the game quality I set to medium, but what's more important is upscaling mode I actually turned to performance. I probably could have put it on ultra performance, but I don't want too much of those little weird artifacting things to happen to the textures. And I went all the way to 70.5 frames, but in that zone, 60 frames. So I got another 10 frames on top of what I was already getting, 20 frames on top of that initial test, just from dropping the quality a little bit, which in my opinion is quite indistinguishable. It even kept like the mesh models like at high quality and things like that. Game quality medium really didn't impact it that much, but the frames, I got so many more frames out of it. So this is the recommended setup. I would go with 1080 or 1440. I would go with this setup any day of the week. After that, I put the game quality to low, and you can see that my frames per second were basically the same. They were comparable. Okay, my average was a little bit higher with 3 extra frames, but I definitely wouldn't be dropping to low quality if you don't have to. Stick with medium. Low, I think, looks a lot worse. Like you can see the difference between these two shots. The grass makes so much more sense in the medium settings. The character model and the just all the character, everything. The tree is so much different. The brambles are very different as well. The rocks are actually a lot more similar than I thought they would be, but just the medium quality is so much better. I wouldn't be bothered on going for the low quality. And the last test I did was 1080p, low ray tracing, so ray tracing enabled. High game quality and quality upscaling mode, so pretty much the same as my test 1 but on a lower resolution, and actually ended up getting 60 frames. It dropped off quite a bit in the village, I believe, but basically you can go really high settings with 1080p. I have a 3080 graphics card and a really good CPU. I've heard of some people having their CPU, which is your processor, actually bottleneck your GPU a little bit. So even if your GPU is really good, your graphics processor, your CPU still needs to be able to keep up somewhat to be able to give you that good performance in the game. So I hope you learned something. I hope you understand which settings to mess around with. Please subscribe for more content like this. I'm going to go even further into a deep dive when the game actually comes out, analyze specific fights, and which settings you need to change to make sure you're getting the best performance possible in Monster Hunter Wilds.